to jump into self-consciousness, I think that move at the end of Force and Understanding,
Mm-hmm.
where he brings in infinity,
Mm-hmm.
is so important. But again, I understand, like, I understand arriving at infinity through the kind of these reflections on force, but quite how we got to infinity, I lose a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think infinity comes in at paragraph 161 in
Yeah.
the, yeah, and this kind of like, I don't know, because I think without that claim about infinity, we don't understand why the I in then in 164 has quite the force that it has. So I take it that the infinity in 161 lays the ground for the I in 164. And then the I is, of course, important going forward into self-consciousness. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
the I, sorry, in the sense of the first person pronoun,
Mm-hmm.
not the I. Right, because in 164, he writes, this apprehension of the difference as it is in truth. So if you're in Miller, it's on 102, page 102. This
Mm-hmm.
apprehension of the difference as it is in truth, or the apprehension of infinity as such, is for us, or in itself, merely implicit. The exposition of its concept belongs to science. And then just one sentence on below there, he introduces the I of self-consciousness. And so there is that, I think in order to move from consciousness to to self-consciousness, um, there's something about the infinitude of forces that's really crucial to constituting the I. That I take. I don't know if you guys. I didn't watch your the notes from last time, so I apologize for that if you already covered this. But if we're talking about like details, I take it that this is a crucial detail, because you don't get to self-consciousness if you don't have an I, and you don't get to the I if you don't have this infinitude of forces.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to kind of linger over that hinge, maybe that turning point for a
Mm-hmm.
second, just to, yeah. Is that all? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. We kind of brought that up towards the end,
Mm,
but I don't think
mm,
either of us had a
yeah.
coherent answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so, the phenomenology is operating on a number of different fronts at once. One is something like this dialectical logic that's unfolding the developments of natural consciousness towards absolute knowing, and that each step by a kind of quasi-Kantian logic is supposed to advance from sense certainty all the way to absolute knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a way in which it's like rediscovering history or reframing intellectual history, that kind of every moment that's occurred in the history of philosophy for Hegel, and we might just call it intellectual history, is also like articulatable by way of this dialectical logic.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, I think there's also kind of reworking of Kantian philosophy, but we can set that aside. So I take it that like if we think about this in terms of the history of philosophy, infinitude and the Cartesian ego, cogito, are quite connected to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes when I'm like at a loss for like what Hegel is doing by his own logic, I think, okay, what in the history of philosophy is like this move that he's making?
Mm-hmm.
And so then I think, okay, well, what is it about infinitude and the Cartesian cogito that's so important? Because we get that in meditation 3. You get that the argument, so in 2, he introduces the cogito, but then in 3, he gives his first argument for the existence of God
Mm-hmm.
based on the concept of infinitude, and says, well, we have a concept of infinity. We ourselves are finite, so there must be something that is infinite
Mm-hmm.
that posited in us the concept of
Mm-hmm.
infinitude. And so since Descartes, concepts of subjectivity and notions of infinitude have been connected with one another. And so when I think about these 161, 162, 163, 164, I lean on that moment in the history of philosophy a little bit to think about why for Hegel kind of an infinite play of forces leads to subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that helps as a kind of crutch. It doesn't exactly explain his dialectical argument, but it at least like surfaces one intellectual historical reason for connecting self-consciousness and infinity with one another,
Mm-hmm.
because Descartes did it. You know?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, here it seems like because like a lot of the stuff on like law and on the supersensible world in
Yeah.
towards the end of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
seems like it's directly trying to address some of the commitments that Kant had made to like what
Absolutely.
things we can legitimately talk about.
Right. Yeah.
But then Hegel, I guess, seems to think that we don't, like, the understanding runs up against the infinite. We can't, like, we find all of these determinations that are constantly going into their opposite.
Right.
And
Right.
we instead find ourselves unable to kind of grasp this as a whole. And
Yep.
in some way, it's almost as if, like Kant in the third critique finds
Mm-hmm.
the sublime, and the sublime kind of portends to uh, uh, sort of dissolve the subject or show the subject's limits. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
it's almost as if Hegel posits that as like an organizing role in his sort of metaphysics, where
Yeah. Yeah.
this sort of like infinity, rather than just kind of like breaking up the subject or making the subject do harm to itself, becomes like the motor of sort of like the transformation of the concept, which in turn has
Mm-hmm.
to do with
Mm-hmm.
changing the sort of modes of consciousness that
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
inhabited by actual living beings or humans.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And it's true that where we distinguish between, or well, I was trained to distinguish between the first and third critique and think of them as kind of somewhat different projects.
Mm-hmm.
The third critique, like, you know, Hegel would have been trained to kind of think of the third critique as like the culmination and like realization of the first critique. And so any kind of residual Cartesian aspects of the first critique give way in the third critique, to this, the romanticized subject, and that the sublime opens up, right, breaks open the subject.
Mm-hmm.
I like that line. There's I think there's a line a little bit on in self-consciousness where he says something. I mean, that would help with desire and why we get to desire
Mm-hmm.
so quickly. And again, that's one of those moments where, at least for me, I can just speak for myself, sorry, just to say like, okay, I get it. I understand why you would say that, but quite how we got to desire seems like it kind of snuck up on me. But if you're thinking about infinitude or infinity as kind of the essence of force, but it's an essence of force that both opens the object and the subject, then like once the I is posited at the end of consciousness, then it closes again. And so like when infinite force is closed in on the subject, we get life, or we get desire on the subjective side, and we get the living natural world on the objective side. So I think that, that's really interesting. I think that's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's what I thought. On 163, he talks about infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self movement.
Yep.
That's what I thought immediately with that's desire, that kind of those complex movements that he's now going to unfold into the sort of
and that's exactly the line I was looking for, because he writes, it's the first sentence of 163, infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement in which whatever is determined in one way or another, for example, as being, is rather the opposite of this determinateness. This, no doubt, has been from the start the soul of all that has gone before, but it is in the inner world that has first freely and clearly shown itself. So, right, this infinite unrest of pure self-movement has been what's driving it all along, but there's a way in which kind of we didn't realize it because it didn't kind of get situated, like, determinately situated as inner difference, as he calls it here at the end of, I think at the end of consciousness is where he introduces the idea of inner difference. And so these differences kind of seemed they seem kind of like contingent differences rather than difference being constitutive of subjectivity and objectivity. Yeah, that's good.
Trying to look at my notes here.
And so he also identifies this infinity with the pure concept, right? The absolute concept.
Right.
Um,
That's in the middle of 164, right?
I think it's at 162 where
Oh,
he
okay. So,
introduces the simple infinity.
mm-hmm.
Says the soul of the world, the universal bloodstream, and here you can also kind of see some of
Yeah.
his like
Mm-hmm.
organicism come into
Right.
play,
Right.
where
Yeah. Yeah.
he is very clearly like emphasizing that like natural life kind of like pervades the
Mm-hmm.
concept and
Mm-hmm.
indeed is like identical with the
Right.
concept in some way.
Right.
Um, and I think we were just talking about like how the infinity doesn't come to be like as such until
Right.
until it like is posited as internal difference.
Right.
And in some way, right, like that comes he talks about how the concept is there like throughout all of these earlier moments of
Mm-hmm.
the phenomenology, but
Sure.
it's not the
Right.
concept recognized as the
Right.
concept yet.
Right.
Whereas once we get into self-consciousness in the I, suddenly the concept kind of comes into relief,
Right.
and we're able to see its movements as partaking in this
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
larger development.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like this idea. This, like Hegel's relationship to romanticism and the third critique is interesting because where, someone like Herder or one of the, like Schlegel brothers would have like embraced the kind of dissolution of the subject
Mm-hmm.
in infinitude, in the sublime, and in
Mm-hmm.
the um, the starry heaven, or I can't remember Kant's formulation of it, but the starry firmament, like
Mm-hmm.
that the romantics really, they thought we could become one with nature then, and that this was what the great promise kind of the third critique. And I take it that like Hegel both agrees and disagrees with that. So it's like the subject breaks open on the rock of infinitude, which is the truth of the concept, and yet at the same time like is like reconstituted in a different form. Like it kind of comes to be one with its essence. I take that to be some of the resonance of the notion of a soul. And he was at this point in his career, he was just leaving the seminary. He was trained as a seminarian, and so there are certain Christian theological aspects to this thought that we could talk about more.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Hippolyte actually pointed out that the role that the infinite plays in Hegel's philosophy, like during his younger years,
Mm-hmm.
he explicitly identified like contemplation of the infinite as part of religion, but
Right.
then here he's incorporating it into the like very movement of the dialectic in
Right.
his philosophy. So there's
Yeah.
some sense in which like
Yeah.
he's sort of almost combined religion and philosophy again after
Yeah.
Kant famously tried to
Right.
cleave
Right.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
faculty.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I mean, I think we see that importantly in the lordship and bondage section, where like the fear of death that the bonds person, the worker, maybe I'll just say worker. A lot of these terms are quite loaded historically speaking, so maybe worker is the kind of the easiest historically speaking. But when the worker risks their life and faces death, they face death in this way that's absolute. Like they he has got a good phrase about that like they witness their witness to their fear is absolute. And I take it that that's a way in which this kind of like the infinite awe of God isn't just a kind of, because Kant like was willing to say, well, of course there's a God. It's just in this kind of absolute beyond. And again, that's what the Romantics really liked, was this kind of just dissolution of the self
mhm.
into the eternal. And yeah, there's a way in which like the already in the bondsman movement of like witnessing, like seeing one's death or facing one's death is a kind of opening to infinitude, but it's not a dissolving, because the worker doesn't die. The worker just kind of stares into the abyss of dissolution and then comes back to
They like
self.
recognize that finitude is necessary, and they look on it almost with like
Exactly.
despair or with
Right.
it's almost like they hate death at that point. And they
Right.
recognize that
Yeah.
they rely on life to be able to
Yeah.
continue being for itself. Or
Yeah. Yeah, that's all really good. I think I knew there was something to this infinitude stuff, and I wanted to linger over it a little bit because it just seems like a crucial hinge on which to
Hmm.
get, to quote unquote, get out of consciousness, um, to get into self-consciousness. This infinitization of the play of forces is like kind of the moment where it happens. And so I take it, like I don't quite get this move he makes against Kant. So he said, like, the kind of Kantian argument in the background here about the supersensible and the in itself is something like, there's a play of the like, causal dynamics in the empirical world
Hmm.
are all true. Newton's right, no question about that. But it's all at the level of, the empirical. It's all at the level of appearances, and quote unquote behind, or, like, in itself, the natural world is, like, impenetrable. It's not causally structured. It's not temporally structured. It's not spatially structured. So there's this kind of super sensible core that's like, behind the play of appearances that we call causation and, temporal sequentiality and all these kind of things. And then Hegel makes this move where he's like, and he recognizes that he kind of rediscovers Kant's, like, the play of forces pushes us to the need for a super sensible, like, something. But then he makes this move, like this inversion of the inverted world, where he then says the supersensible world becomes this play of, like, infinite forces. And I never quite understood that move. I don't know if you guys, again, talked about that last time, but like how the supersensible world, how the in itself, how the domain of God and law and truth becomes a kind of equal, like, play of, what's his expression, attracting force and suppressing, like, or that's not exactly his word, but like this, that the Kantian that the Kantian heaven becomes a place of kind of apparent forces. It's almost like, I don't know if this analogy will work, but it's almost like Kant got in, like Homer came back, like, and the gods turn out to be petty and lustful and drunk, and, and the moral law turns out to be like, just every man, whoever can interpret it, that, like, and I never quite understood that move in Hegel, and it moves so quickly there. Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a little bit before where we were talking.
Last time
Where,
that was
yeah,
one of the things I was pushing on because I could not.
yeah,
I was struggling to understand this, the logic of like the inverted world, where he says like,
right,
you know,
157.
and
Yeah.
I think what sort of what he's doing is, it's still dialectical. There's never a point where that stops, right? So there are these moments that he'll kind of like endorse for a little bit, and then kind of like only to do so to develop it to a certain point and then
Mm-hmm.
abandon it. And he
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
like introduces this inverted world as though like, things appear to us in a certain way, and we know that that's like liable to error.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can posit that, like, and there has been a view sort of like this in the history of philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
that like whatever is not, or that what does not appear must be opposite of that which does appear.
Right.
And then he kind
Right.
of goes on to say that this is
Mm.
like the first supersensible world, and that a second supersensible world sets itself up in
Right.
relation to
Right.
this
Right.
first one.
Yeah, that's
And
at
I just get like,
157.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
I
think
just get,
I think something that you just said there is good, that I mean, I don't think this is the right reading of Kant, and Heidegger
mhm,
basically comes along and says, and he maybe had Hegel in mind. So in the famous kind of Heidegger Kant book, he says, just because Kant calls it an appearance doesn't mean it necessarily has to be an appearance of something like that, or like that of structure is different. It's not like, you know, of isn't necessarily like, and this is key to phenomenology. It's like if it's an appearance of something, that doesn't mean that that which doesn't appear has to be like the dialectical opposite of what appears.
mhm,
And I think that is how Hegel is reading Kant at this point, is saying like, okay, well, you made the domain of empirical reality this field of forces, this field of causation, this field of natural law and electrical current and all these kind of things. But in so doing, you posited the supersensible world as not all of that. And in that gesture of saying it's not all of that, by dialectical negation, it becomes the all of that. So maybe that's why I struggle with that move, because I take it that Kant isn't necessarily committed to the thing in itself not being spatial or temporal, that, you know, a cat attack. So, yeah. Sorry, did that make sense? Yeah.
One thing that I think is, maybe see what you think about this, part of the critique as well of the supersensible inverted world is the kind of implicit divorce of the world in itself and the world for another. And it seems like, you know, the world of appearances, the sensible world, is the world for consciousness, and the world of the supersensible ends up becoming the world in itself. And I think for Hegel, that divorce ends up in this, I think, goes back to what we've talked about with the skepticism, leads to like a way in which you completely have no ability of connecting the sensible and the super sensible. So, you know, the laws and force end up just becoming this kind of tautological or just like notional certainty. This kind of just, all we're doing is just saying, well, gravity is things falling down. Well, we already had that experience in the sensible. So what more content are we actually gaining? Yeah. So with that divorce, I think he has issues with that kind of divorce.
Yeah, that's a good way to put
it. Kind of seeing that in the beginning of 159.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and that is central to Hegel's criticism of Kant. Generally, is that the in itself is not in itself if it's not also kind of for, you know, in and for itself. That there is no kind of objective domain that's just, I don't know, there other than I think a good place where that comes up is at 166 on the bottom, just to kind of give text to what you just said, and that might be a better way to think about the supersensible, the inversion and inversion. So he writes, or alternatively, it's the second to last sentence of 166. He writes, or alternatively, if we call the concept what the object is in itself, but call the object what it is qua object or for another, then it is clear that the being in itself and being for another are one and the same. And I think that's a good move there. For the in itself is consciousness, but equally it is that for which another, the in itself is. And it is for consciousness that the in itself of the object and the being of the object for another are one and the same. The I is the content of the connection and the connecting itself. So a pretty dense sentence, but I take it that's so thanks. I think that's right. Yeah.
One of the interesting things too for me is I, you know, was reflecting on maybe some of the distinctions between Hegel and Kant, because some of the same stuff is what some of the same conclusions as Kant is getting to, in terms of self-consciousness's role in basically, you know, whether you conflate self-consciousness and consciousness or they're sort of logically dependent on one another. You know, the way that Hegel gets there is through, as we talked about before, this kind of immanent analysis of consciousness, that like actually if you follow consciousness all the way through, you end up leading to this kind of point of self-consciousness, versus the kind of Kantian moves of, well, what sort of are the deductive conditions of consciousness? So you're kind of seeing this sort of, you know, his Aristotelianism kind of coming through in the way that he wants to handle the question of the relation of self-consciousness and consciousness.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about this today, that you know, Hegel anticipates something like developmental psychology in a way that the Kantian transcendental argument, going from the empirical and the experiential as it is, and then transcendentally deducing the conditions of the possibility of that, is a kind of old form of argument, and it didn't get taken up into the sciences in the way that this kind of developmental story got taken up into it. So I think that's right. I mean, I don't think there are any cognitive psychologists who are telling a story about self-consciousness along these lines, but I mean, I don't, I don't know, you know, like he's simultaneously like anticipatory of what we would call kind of the science of consciousness in our own sense. And yet at the same time tells the story in ways that just like no one in contemporary consciousness science, otherwise known as psychology, would tell it. Yeah.
It's kind of how I read the desire section, almost as this kind of like thinking of it as this kind of like primal state of like, we, you know, the first time we become aware of self-consciousness is
Mm-hmm.
when we say I have a
Yeah.
lack and I have a desire from this lack to
Yeah.
fill something,
Yeah. Yeah.
I desire this table because I want to eat,
Mm-hmm.
or I desire this other thing because of this other
Yeah.
lack. And it's kind of this almost primal state of desire that first instigates
Right.
self-consciousness is sort of how I read it. I don't know if
Yeah. No, I think that
others had different readings, but
The objet petit a, right, of Lacan.
Yep.
I get so many.
You're gonna have Hippolyte in mind. Yeah, I think, I mean, again, I think the story we told about, the play of forces becoming infinitized, I take it in the very moment that they breach the supersensible world. Because kind of like when they're merely plays of appearances in the domain of the empirical, then there's no such thing as infinite force. Like there's only finite manifestations of force. But once once understanding there at the end of consciousness says, well, right, as you said, like, force is what makes two things move towards each other. That's just tautological. We're not saying anything we didn't already know. We're giving new language to it. But once understanding wants to kind of make a law of that and situate the kind of second law of thermodynamics in the domain of like lawfulness, and that those laws don't change. That's precisely the moment in that move of, kind of from empirical observation of causal laws to the rendering of those causal laws into fixed Newtonian principles, is the move that has to be made in order to infinitize force. Because now you've moved it from like, oh, under these circumstances, under these friction conditions, given these materials, we'll have this kind of causal mechanism. Now you've made it into, like all, all objects, act and react, or whatever the second law of thermodynamics is. So I think that's, I don't know if that's helpful too, is to think about like rendering the domain of appearances into law is precisely what kind of opens the gate for infinitization, and transforms like local forces into the kind of force that will lead to life, thinking that the world is dynamically alive, and then that the correlate of that is that we desire, and that desire is just this, absolute force.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty striking too that he has this kind of transcendental sort of endorsement of apperception, but then he starts self-consciousness with,
Mm-hmm.
The subject is primarily one invested in the world. That's where self-consciousness starts,
Mm-hmm.
not by the kind of Kantian distance, stepping back from the world, and I think there's, I don't know if he talks much about embodiment in this section, but you can kind of see where like the Merleau-Ponty's and folks
Mm-hmm.
of the world like can kind of pick up on some of this starting point,
right,
and take it in that kind of direction.
Yeah, so my one contribution to the Discord conversation was a bit ago when I said there's something important about objectivity in the phenomenology, and because it's natural consciousness he's dealing with, he explicitly says I'm just going to deal with natural consciousness, and it's something like natural consciousness cannot shake an epistemological commitment to objectivity. So like why does this infinite play of forces not look again the romantic way? Why does it not look Kantian? Why does it like end up being that we want to lay our hands on the objective world, transform it, own it, possess it? Like why do we do that? And I take it that it takes a long time for natural consciousness to break through the boundaries or break through the structures of objectivity, that there's something persistent in that form as the like correlate of consciousness, that it takes a long time for consciousness to learn away from objectivity. So like object is the like locus of this infinite force, like it. And so what do I want to do with it? I want to make it mine. I want to transform nature. I think someone said something about like this is the dawn of enlightenment, right? So I want to make the natural landscape look exactly like, make it human, and like, because like objects defy us and they like won't be us. They won't reflect us perfectly. They won't like, we can't make the world completely human in a certain way. Yeah. And right, we're now at the unfortunate end of that long history of Enlightenment domination of nature. So it didn't go well. If we could go back, if we could go back and be like, don't dominate nature because it's not going to go well. Like don't try.
Totally.
Yeah.
Isn't that what he's trying to work out in the lordship and bondage section, that once we've kind of are in this sort of predicament between like preserving the individuality and independence of the thing, and recognizing this sort of movement of desire that can be destructive, like how do we sort of reconcile ourselves with the world, the objective world, and with the otherness of it, and without doing violence to it.
Yeah, this is like back to the like weird relationship with romanticism. It's like if you read the third critique as this dissolution of the empirical self towards the kind of rising of the moral self, or the kind of like sublime self, then also objectivity goes away too, because like the aestheticized object isn't something to be dominated. It's not something to be made sense of. So one answer to that question is already in Kant, and then it gets taken up in the German critical theorist to say that, like, aestheticized objectivity is not, it's still objective. There's still objective kind of components to it, but it undermines, it interrupts that kind of domination modality, and like we contemplate the aesthetic object, or we wonder at it, or we I don't know, all the things we do with aesthetic objects. But again, there's a weird way in which like Hegel like comes to the threshold of the third critique in this notion of the supersensible world and the infinite, and then come like the next chapter is, oh, we're back with objects again. We're back with like rocks that need to be quarried, and so he turns back from that aesthetic moment, and instead I guess because of desire, like the one thing that Kant, in our mode when we are aesthetically appreciating an object in a Kantian sense, we are not desiring it. We don't want it. We don't want to put our hands on it. We don't want to change it. We want to we become passive spectators to it, and then desire rises, and with desire being the driving force here, self-consciousness wants to just kind of again put its hands on the world and force it to kind of take on human form again.
And I think this is where he uses a language, I don't know, it's like formative activity, where it's just like the way that his disposition towards the world is this kind of desire. The way desiring beings dispose themselves to this world is in this very, like Chris said, embodied way in which we're kind of shaping the world and this kind of thing, or taking the world in.
Miller translates it as formative activity. I think that's
and so that's like
196, but I think it comes up before that. Right, the stuff about work is at the end of 195.
It's interesting because this is the point, where he introduces terms of recognition, which becomes, crucial to the master-slave dialectic.
Yeah.
And it's also the point where in self-consciousness, we attain activity. No longer is consciousness merely passive, receiving objects and sort of sensing the world, and like taking that to be everything, like knowing everything in that way, or certain of things in that way. We've moved, past seeing things as mere things, or seeing things as mere this suches, and have gone and tried to articulate the necessity behind things, and found that we weren't able to, and that instead we just kind of found the concept, the sort of like simple, abstract unity, the medium that all of these things are sort of immersed within. And then in that, the essence of, or like what the essential pole is, shifts from the object to the self, and that's how we're sort of brought back into the self.
Absolutely.
And it's certainly interesting because it's like at this point we start to appropriate the outside in order to individuate ourselves. We see other things as sort of impinging on ourselves and as somehow important to our own self-development, our own sort of recognition from others, which is crucial, I think, to this chapter.
And this is why I wanted to backtrack and talk about infinitude and the I, because you could move into self-consciousness by thinking of the I with which we begin in self-consciousness as a discrete or particularized I, but I think it's an infinite I. It's a kind of like I without determination. And so the first way in which it undertakes to constitute its own determinacy is by imposing its agency on the world. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and it's weird because like the chapter starts and the I is basically just like devoid of content, right? Like it's
Right.
sort of just like it's an abstract form at that point. It hasn't really sort of developed
Right.
any meaningful determinations, like you said.
Right. It's the this here now of self. You know, it's like it's it's the self as infinite subject or something. It's the kind of romantic self. Yeah.
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 174 is a
Okay.
good, I was
Yep.
just going to draw attention to a good text that kind of, I mean, right off the bat, top of 174,
Yeah.
page 109. Simple I is this genus or the simple universal for which the differences are not differences, only by its being the negative essence of the shaped independent moments.
Yep.
So yeah, just like you said, this kind of universal I or this genus, interesting language there, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Recognition is super important. And again, like, I think if we, like when we arrive at the moment and we think, okay, is he right phenomenologically that self-consciousness and recognition are important? We disagree. I mean, I think that's right. He gets the phenomenology right there. But again, in terms of the dialectical logic by which we arrive at recognition from self-consciousness, I wasn't, like, it just comes so quickly. And, all of a sudden we have this category of recognition. And so I wasn't sure if one of you tracked that argument. Yeah, it's kind of
The
like,
only
yep.
place I can
Yeah.
track it is in 176. He kind of does this sort of way in which desire must lead to this kind of duplication of self-consciousness, which then, as he says in 177, shows how a self-consciousness you want desire to kind of this space where you realize self-consciousness necessitates another self-consciousness, and thus then you open up recognition from that, and where we get, I think 177 is like a huge pivotal section where there we get the first kind of mention of spirit,
right.
As well as the kind of line of I that is we and we that is I. But I agree, I'm not quite sure how 176 does enough to show 177,
and then 178. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's where it has to happen. Yeah.
Well, when he says a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness at the beginning of 177, he's talking about other subjectivities that we're surrounded by, or like, I understood that he was shifting from like the sort of object, like from natural consciousness and its object orientedness. And then now he's like when he goes into this lordship and bondage passage, he's starting to realize like this desiring movement that we have, instead of like it attaching to objects and trying to take those in, it turns towards these subjectivities that we're enveloped within.
Right.
And trying to make sense of that. And
yeah,
I don't know.
I think, I mean, maybe you said it half tongue in cheek, PJ, about the Lacanian objet petit a, and Christy says something about the very structure of desire being lack. But maybe that's helpful here. It's kind of like, like desire doesn't like, sorry, a couple thoughts at once. I'll parse them. Like, sense certainty's relationship to the object didn't feel like a kind of situation of lack, like that we felt that the object outside of us somehow, like, we lacked it. And well, he did say that we, like, the animal incorporates it. Yeah, so maybe that's why recognition comes in, is because the very structure of desire is that, like, self-consciousness is driven by desire, and it has this lack structure to it. And the only way for that lack structure to be satisfied, it's at the last sentence of 175.
Yeah, I was about to point
right.
it out.
Yeah. But that sentence, self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. That sentence only reads if we think of desire in terms of lack, I think. Because that means that self-consciousness in itself is unsatisfied. But desire, like, self-consciousness is desire ridden at this point. So, like, why is it dissatisfied? Well, because the very structure of desire is lack. Yeah. So that, yeah.
And he talks about like the self-sufficiency, right? Because a self-consciousness is essentially like for itself, and it's like self-determining in some way. It moves itself in this and towards its own ends. But in order to do that, it needs, I guess, negation. And so he's kind of like pointing out that, I guess, like there isn't like a way to set like boundaries or have the negation and the self-consciousness's element without another self-consciousness, I guess.
Yeah. But yeah, why isn't infinite self-consciousness like happy with itself? Like I guess, I mean, that's a silly way to say it, but kind of like, you know, just to use an analogy with child psychology, which again isn't exactly fair to phenomenology, but you know, like the absolutely narcissistic infant who is just a bundle of energy and just like shits and eats and does whatever it wants. I mean, where's the lack there? Like what would ever like I mean, we know that organically it gets to the point, like it just like it grows, and so all that goes away. But like what's imminent within, if this is an imminent dialectical process, and it's just analogy, but like what imminently is wrong with the narcissistic infant? Like what would ever occasion imminently that state to you know, to need another or to want another?
You
know,
yeah, it's interesting.
It's like a
I guess part of
yeah.
Well, to part of how I'm reading 177 is again to bring in our buddy Lacan and the mirror stage. This idea that, you know, only so, you know, as he says, only so, namely self-consciousness for a self-consciousness, only in this just unity itself in its otherness become explicit for it. Yeah, so the way that I'm reading that is basically it's only when one encounters the other self-consciousness that self-consciousness even presents itself as a unified subject explicitly to that self-consciousness.
Right.
So in the same kind of mirror stage of Lacan, only in the parents treating the other self-consciousness as a unified subject does that unified subject then think of itself as unified self-consciousness.
Right.
And so it seems almost that it's kind of a necessity. Desire then brings about this kind of necessity of engaging these other self-consciousnesses that then mandated of yourself, and then there opens up the desire to then have that recognition with other self-consciousnesses. I don't know, that's kind of how I'm taking.
That seems right, yeah. And so the disanalogy with the contented infant is that it's not self-conscious. You know, it's right. It's kind of in a state of self-certainty or sense certainty. You know, I was just thinking about like why the structure of desire pushes this forward.
No, that's a great question.
Yeah, because Nietzsche will just come along and say, well, you just have the wrong kind of desire. Like you just, you know, like desire isn't necessarily lack. Why assume as much? But if you build that in, then the self-consciousness for itself like is insufficient, and it kind of requires someone else.
Yeah, and like part of the Lacanian story is that like the child, the infant, is introduced to something that it wants, and then it has it and it wants more, and that's when it sort of starts becoming individuated as a subject. Is the desire is not sated, it doesn't stop. And
but that's not imminent. That's like, you know, that's just being part of reality, because like, you know, like I'm just trying to think of like, here you have this like spinning point of the kind of infinite eye, and it's just full of desire, and, you know, like and what makes it go outside of itself? You know, like why ever go outside of itself? But again, maybe just on the presumption that desire, the dynamic of desire is lack. And maybe that's something about force as, I'm sorry, I should just remember, I should get that, what, beckoning force and responding force or whatever.
The
Do you
law of
remember?
attraction or whatever.
Yeah, law of attraction and law of repulsion. But he has that particular formulation of it that like there's the eliciting force and the elicited force or whatever.
Right.
Maybe that sets up why desire has the structure that it does, is that since desire is force rendered in self-consciousness, it inherits, quote unquote, inherits the structure of force. And since force differentiated between kind of force that elicited force and force that responded to that eliciting, maybe that's why it has that. Sorry, here's me in the weeds. We
Well, and
don't
I
need,
think
yeah.
perhaps part, and like my first sort of impression about the role of desire in this part is that, he's trying to tell a story of natural consciousness, and he opens up this section with this story on like life, and it's like about, he's kind of doing this Spinozistic thing where he has, natura naturans, where there's like this life as a process that's infinite and has like this sort of cyclical structure to it. And then there are these determinate life, like these beings that are determinations of life, sort of they take on shapes within life. And so I think, part of desire, I guess, would be participating in this process in some way. Like, and I think in that way, the desire also does some work in terms of like will, right? Like it's the kind of like driving force behind our like organic beings. And so I guess
in Spinoza, it would be conatus, right? That would be, but I mean, I absolutely agree. I think, Hegel owes a deep debt to Spinoza, as most great modern philosophy does. But this goes back to Chris, your point about transcendentalism. Like Spinoza doesn't make an argument for monadic determination, because he's just like, of course there are monadic determinations. Look around. Like, there isn't just an infinite, I can't just deal with an infinite God, or, God's as nature. Like I have to also, they're like their fingernail clippers also, so I just have to deal with them. Whereas like Hegel has to tell a story about why there's determinacy, like because he's not doing this kind of transcendental condition, even though Spinoza doesn't have that language, this kind of transcendental condition for the possibility of reality. I mean, that's basically Spinoza's argument. The ethics is like, in order to get reality, you need an infinite God. Like being wouldn't be what it is if it weren't for my substance monism, which, whether that works or not is another matter. But again, Hegel's not making that move. He's like, he needs to tell a story about why God ever created anything, I guess. And like that, there's a weird way in which, like at the beginning of self-consciousness, we see like an infinite God creating something, and it's like, why? Like, why would you create something? So sorry to
Yeah, no, I think that's to point to a nice quotable, or at the end of 177. Where he says, where we enter the notion of spirit, where it leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now, and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond, and steps out into the spiritual daylight of the present. Right.
Read that out loud to my roommates earlier, because I was like,
amazing.
this is pithy. I like this.
It's one of the few pithy lines that Hegel's got.
He has his poetic moments, absolutely, and I think that's like, I mean that and that whole the sentence before is really important too. And I mean, there's that 177 is a very rich paragraph, right? Because he writes just 2 sentences before that, he writes, with this we already have before us the concept of spirit. Again, that's the first reference. But then he says, what still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousness, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence, I that is we, and we that is I. And so for those of us interested in political philosophy, like that's an important like moment, kind of anticipating, to certain Marxist things. But yeah, and then, right, it is in self-consciousness, in the notion of spirit, the consciousness first finds its turning point where it leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now. And so I guess maybe my question is kind of like, okay, reverse the trajectory of this text, because if this is spirit all along, and if it's just the unfolding of the concept all along, but like we are just following natural consciousness in its despairing stumbling towards that realization. But really what's going on is that spirit in its absoluteness differentiates itself, determines itself, specifies and pluralizes itself, it strikes me that this is a moment where we can first ask, like, why did it do it? Like, why did spirit differentiate itself into a group of I's if the truth of spirit in the end is going to be a we? Like, why does it? And so here's maybe a Christian theological answer. Is kind of like, the Christian God had to come to earth. Like God had to fall to earth in a certain sense. And so maybe there's a kind of theological logic there behind this Hegelian move that he doesn't, like, it doesn't worry him or something. Like, gods come to earth. That's what they do, True gods, sorry. Not the wrong gods.
Not the false gods.
Not the false gods. The false gods stay in their heavens.
I think this line, you're so right that 177 is so packed. I just noticed this, enjoys perfect freedom and independence.
Mm-hmm.
I that is we and we that is I. So much of modern philosophy at this point is seeing freedom as this kind of unconditioned state, and here he's basically saying freedom is actually grounded in this dialectic of couching the I within a we. That the possibility, to use that conditions language, the conditions possible for perfect freedom is a we. Is having a conditioned self. Which is going to obviously be a critical idea later on. But I think that is just, man, what a line.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have the right language, but I think like he provides a sort of like far more dynamic like grounding for self-consciousness. I think there's certain ontological ramifications to this sort of I and we, and instead of I being this sort of discrete substance that finds itself pushing against other things, instead it already has assumed that the I and the we are like interdependent. And to truly be able to realize self-consciousness, one, it's in many ways contingent upon the otherness of other self-consciousnesses. And so I find that to be a more dynamic, interdependent vision of.
I mean, I take it that, and I think this is, if this is right, then this is a really radical move that Hegel makes. But, for the history of modern philosophy, substance was that which was self-defined or self-defining, like in a kind of quasi-Aristotelian way. So like, to be substantial was just to be kind of self-sufficient. And then I take it that Hegel's coming along and saying something like self-sufficiency inherently includes and involves other determinacy. That to be a substance, which is what a human being is, and what nature is, and what the world is not. It's not just self-sufficiency. It's a self-sufficiency which is kind of other referential and other reliant. Reliance, not, that's too strong of a word, but other kind of oriented, maybe is a better way to say that. And that's just like, no one had used that language. Like, I mean, if that's Aristotle, then I didn't understand Aristotle. Like I took Aristotelian substance to be, and which lays the groundwork for the whole tradition afterwards, to be self-sufficiency. That the Aristotelian God just spins in the void and is perfect substance, and the Cartesian substance of the cogito is like, it's disconnected from its body, and all these kind of things. And I take it that Hegel's coming along and saying, oh no, self is substance, but in being a self as substance, you're actually a we, or you're connected, you're connected to other self-consciousnesses, not kind of despite your substantiality, but because of your like, you wouldn't be a substantial self if not for the way in which substance refers to and includes otherness and difference.
Perhaps that's where the infinite plays its role too, the infinite located in that substance to be able to ground this subject. And make sense of this sort of interdependent vision of the I and the we.
Well, that's Levinas's whole take, right? Is that the infinity is that intersubjective moment.
Oh, absolutely.
But I mean, that if what I just said is right, that's already here in Hegel, which is like so rad, like
so
in 1829, whatever this is, to like just step in and just transform the notion of substance is like so so impressive, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was thinking too that, you know, a significant aspect of this chapter is trying to show how cognition and recognition are intimately tied together. It's the same word in German. But I think it underscores how, like, we wouldn't have the resources to think of ourselves as I's, as, you know, I am this person, you know, occupying this place, thinking these things with these commitments, without having other people to help me articulate that, to give me the ability to understand myself as, you know, what a self even is. Like, without language, without other people to interact with language, how the hell am I going to be able to be like, you know, like, I am a human in a natural world? That doesn't happen. It's not just like a chance occurrence, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it Kentness and Erkenntnis? Is that the the germ? Yeah, right. Yep.
And I think the translation that I'm reading, which is the newer one, the
Pinker Terry.
I think they use the term cognizance for erkennt, and then cognition for erkenntnis.
That's nice too. Yeah. Yep. Well, you know, we've got the arguably, I mean, especially with what the French did with it and what what Marx did with it. I mean, we have in hand here the most famous part of the phenomenology. You know, the in the Miller translation, lordship and bondage, and but perhaps this is just like so super familiar at this point that we can. I don't know. I mean, I trust you all. I feel like you all get it. But it's just such an important idea that, like, you know, the bonds person works on the world and can transform it, and thus like attains to a certain level of consciousness that the Lord does not, because of their disconnection from working. And
part of it too, right? You want to be recognized by the other, and if you deny that person the ability to cognize, to have a meaningful way of giving you any sort of valid self-recognition, or I think in the case of the master, right, he looks at the servant and he says, like, I do not see myself in you. I am not part of you. And the servant, however, can see himself in the master. And because of that, he gets self-recognition from the other. He's able to attain more of the universal than the master is because of that situation.
Well, you know, the worker is carrying out the will of the, you know, to just like translate it into Marx, you know, just like
Marx.
You know, the proletariat are carrying out the work of the bourgeoisie, and so they have the bourgeoisie's like truncated self-consciousness in themselves in the very act of carrying out their work. So they're both kind of quote unquote working for themselves and then working for another. It's just it's so hard to not read Marx, like just like
totally
lurking at this section.
I will say part of what confuses me or is early in this section, the role of this like life or death struggle and the way in which this relation emerges out of, again, I can't help but think of this kind of just like primal, you know, kind of like Freudian, way of thinking of this, and existential as well, that there's this kind of like, you know, primal state of like how one knows what kind of self-consciousness one is what they're willing to die for, what they're willing to stake their life on. You know, and that's where the subject truly realizes their own identity. But at the same time, it also realizes this approach of that will lead to death and needs to give it up and succumb to this kind of lordship bondage relation. You know, 187 is where he says, where he really gets into this. I think that's where I've got some underlines where he says, insofar as it is the action of the other, each seeks the death of the other. But in doing so, the second kind of action on its own part, is also involved, for the former involves the staking of its own life. As these others, they prove themselves and each other through the life and death struggle.
Yeah, I think the line. I mean, it's an important part of why the lordship bondage section plays out the way it does. Is this that the stake, stakes are high? What is that? Is that Tribe Called Quest? I mean, like stakes are absolute, and I think we miss. And I don't remember how Kojève or Hippolyte talk about this, but like for Hegel, for this to work, the stakes of work and mastery over work are absolute. Like it's it's life or death. We're not working for kind of luxury communism or like I don't know, refinishing our kitchen counters like this. Like the what's getting played out here is the very vitality of the self-consciousnesses at work. And so a line that I thought helped in this domain, in this kind of way, in this thought process, is at the end of 172. So just backtrack a little bit here, where he, again, the argument of it's quite dense, but he writes, since we started from this first immediate unity and return from the moment of formation and of process, and he's talking about how we begin from life as kind of like, almost like, force with a capital F or life with a capital L, as if they're just this, it's this kind of thing. And then we realize that life changes, it's processorial, it's developmental, all these kind of things. So we started from this first immediate unity and returned through the moments of formation and a process to the unity of both of these moments, namely life on one side and self-consciousness on the other. And thus back again to the original simple substance, this reflected unity is different from the first. Contrasted with that immediate unity, or that unity expressed as mere being, the second is the universal unity, which contains all these moments superseded within itself. It is the simple genius which in the movement of life itself does not exist for itself. And then that last line says, life points to something other than itself, vis-a-vis to consciousness, for which life exists as this unity or as genus. And so I take it that that's a reversible logic, that consciousness points to something other than itself. And again, the argument there is so damn dense that I'd lose it a little bit, but it's something like, the other, and it's hard not to say this in just like pithy, like self-help or kind of existential ways, that like the other of life is death, that like, but I take it that he's like making an argument to that conclusion. And I've not heard that too often, like I don't hear kind of like dialectical arguments for why death is the other of life. Like it's true, like he's not wrong, but there's something about like how life and death are dialectically related to one another, so that when the bonds person like exercises their desire, their will, and their agency, and thus gives determination to their life, death is immediately there. That like, it's not that they're going to work themselves to death or something, or they're not going to kind of extend themselves to the point of death. It's in the very exercise of their desire on the object that they kind of face death, because life and death are dialectically related to one another. Is that, again, that's, I'm too in the weeds today, I apologize, but
no, I think that's helpful. I think this other language he uses, I mean, of self-certainty, of like, and he says in 187 again, in order to be raised to the level of self-certainty, one must raise their own life for themselves. Like,
right.
Almost to give, like poker imagery, like the only thing consciousness has to gain that certainty is its own life,
Right. Yeah.
And in kind of your dialectical language, that's realized dialectically,
Right. Yeah. And I mean, if desire is lack structured, which I think that's a good way to read this, we're also talking about we're not talking about desire in a developed emotional, like a philosophy of emotion. We're not talking about like higher order affect for the finer things in life. This is like what Freud would talk about in terms of the drives. Like this is primal life force stuff, that this is what's driving self-consciousness here at the beginning. It's not like my desire for a pair of Nikes or something. Like this is you know, given my organism and its exposure, like I will desire to stay alive. And this, so back to the conatus stuff in Spinoza. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because like in order to stay alive, in some way you have to exteriorize yourself, and Freud talks about it in terms of the organism wants to die on their own terms,
Right.
to kind of determine their own death.
Right.
And I think Hegel's kind of getting at something similar here too, where it's like, in order to like live, you have to risk your life. You have to put your life on the line by going out into the world and by, you know, engaging with various like projects and realizing yourself and getting recognition from others, even if that means, you know, risking your life by associating with other people and by tarrying with things
right.
otherwise might, you know, like hurt you in some way. Like nature isn't a kind place per se. It might be the seat of consciousness, but it's not a friendly place for consciousness per se.
Right. And that's super helpful, because it, like the light, you know, because self-consciousness begins with life with a capital L, like just like kind of indeterminate, like this kind of Wiccan like life force bullshit. But like then it turns out that life's like, you know, the developmental stages of frogs, and like, you know, like the seedings of different plants, and like life is so like determinately rich, and we are the other of that. And so this helps. I mean, that's why we go outside of ourselves, is because we, like, in engaging an organic world, we realize the richness of that organic world, and we are ourselves the other of that. And so we have to go out and, like, you know, try to learn guitar and try to, like, you know, try to run a marathon. You know, like we there's a kind of like vital impulse towards self determination, just because we find the world around us infinitely determinate. Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think 188 right after there is just right on as well. You know, for just as life is the natural setting of consciousness, independence without absolute negativity, so death is the natural negation of consciousness, negation without independence.
Yeah.
Which thus remains without the required significance.
Chris, you sometimes break up a little bit. So sometimes, or is it just?
Oh, I'm sorry, my internet connection is not great.
Oh, it's fine. Just like, it's weird. Like, it's only when you're reading Hegel. So like maybe it's like when you're reading a passage, it'll stop. So maybe like something about your internet provider just is not.
Hates Hegel, yeah.
Yeah.
The internet here is horrible, so I apologize.
Oh no. Yeah. I mean, I think I wanted to wade in the weeds a little bit because, you know, there's something almost like silly about this Hegelian philosophy if you don't engage the details a little bit, because it's kind of like, oh, the opposite of life is death, you know, and like the opposite of desire is lack, you know, and he is saying that, but I take it, you know, like he's making arguments to that effect, and it's not just like, I don't know, bumper sticker and meme, like that kind of thing. So yeah, I take it that life and death are like connected in a deep and dialectically negative way, in a way that the kind of pithy t-shirt stuff doesn't quite get at. But I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I like the line too, and just in terms of the poetry of Hegel. I think it's 195. So because sorry. Sorry. Sorry about that weird technology. But at 195, he writes, however, the feeling of absolute power, both in general and in particular form of service, is only implicitly this dissolution. And although the fear of the Lord is indeed the beginning of the way of wisdom, consciousness, but just one thing that, like, and again, I don't quite understand why this happens and I think Kojev and Hippolyte both talk about this, is why does one self-consciousness risk its life and thus attain to one form and the other one doesn't? You know, like, because there wouldn't be the differentiation of the Lord and the bondsman if they both had the same response to desire and agency. Sorry to understand, like, again, transcendentally or empirically, you know, and Hegel was Aristotelian enough to probably just be like, well, some people are naturally slaves, you know, as Aristotle says in the Politics heinously. But I mean, presumably he has to have an argument for why there's this lordship bondsman bifurcation. And the why they bifurcate is one risks its life and the other one doesn't. And so the bondsman, the bondsperson, the worker, witnesses death and thus is on the way to wisdom, whereas the Lord doesn't. But I don't know quite why, like, one does so differently than the other. Sorry, do you understand my question?
I mean, I'm trying to find some points in the text where he refers to it, because I know he kind of he defines the master at 190 with the master is consciousness existing for itself. So in some ways, there might be a kind of like metaphorical or analogical kind of tool that he's employing here, where like the master is meant to be a kind of form of consciousness that sort of embodies the sort of like independent self-determining aspects of it, and the worker is kind of the part of it that's constrained in some way. But I need to find the definition of the servant. Okay, he says at 193, the truth of the self-sufficient consciousness, I think for you guys, self-sufficient is being translated as independent. The truth of the self-sufficient consciousness is thus the servile consciousness. Sure, this consciousness admittedly first appears external to itself and not as the truth of self-consciousness. And the way the mastery showed that its essence is the inversion of what mastery wants to be, so too in its consummation will servitude become instead the opposite of what it immediately is. So it becomes true self-sufficiency.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I mean, this is a silly way to put the same question. It's kind of like a difference between like mitosis and meiosis or something. Like life, you know, cellular division is just kind of equal division. And then there's this other thing, sexual division. And there's like, and we're getting kind of different division now. We're not getting just merely the bifurcation of one whole into equal parts. We're getting a differentiation into hierarchical wholes, or hierarchical parts. And quite where that hierarchy, why that hierarchy is, I don't know. I mean, that presumably this is at the heart of Marx's engagement with this text, is kind of like questioning questioning the hierarchy implicit in work. Why there are proletariat and why there are bourgeoisie. Sorry, I know all y'all are, since you're like in the 1%, like, I know this is a hard conversation for you to have.
I like my form of consciousness being lordly and superior.
No, right, I understand.
I have no problem with it.
If you could just just kind of like stoop down to my level. I'm just a philosophy professor, so like, I wonder
if it reflects the sort of metaphysical like descriptions that he was earlier describing with respect to desire, like the sort of antagonistic nature sort of positions itself in this way, where you kind of have self-consciousness subordinating other self-consciousnesses simply by a sort of like the movement of desire doing this thing. And so, like, I don't know, that's what I thought, at least, that he used this sort of like this sort of metaphorical language of lordsman. What is it? lordship and bondage to try to describe that sort of antagonistic relation. And
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
To your question, Adrian, earlier, the only thing I can find, and it's not really an answer to sort of the necessity of it, but it just seems like in 189, he seems to describe it as just sort of like the one who first realizes self-consciousness, that life is as essential to it as pure self-consciousness. And then he says, through this, there's posited a pure self-consciousness and a consciousness which is not purely for itself, but for another.
Right there. It
seems like
right.
He's trying to say, like, the one who first realizes that, like, I'm going to have to give in to this life and death struggle because I realize that life is as necessary as the very thing I'm trying to assert, namely, my own self-consciousness.
Yep.
The one that first does that then creates this unequal and opposed unity.
Yep.
But that doesn't necessarily say why it had to be that way.
Right.
Why they couldn't both kind of simultaneously realize that together, and
Right.
But
I think that's right. And PJ, you brought up that language of Terry translates it a little bit differently, but that independent self-consciousness, the truth of independent consciousness. What's the new translation of that? Self-sufficient consciousness.
Self-sufficient.
Yeah, right. That like one kind of takes itself to be self-sufficient and the other one doesn't. And I think 189 is the moment where that happens. Yeah, but if you just read on in 189, both moments are essential. Okay, since to begin with they are unequal and opposed. But what? Since to begin with they are unequal and opposed? Like, yeah, not sure where that inequality comes from. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the servant is not self-sufficient, right? Because he's determined by another determinate being.
Right.
So he can't provide his own sort of ends. And then he talks about how the servant does the work of the master for the master.
Right.
But
that's in 190, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's around there that I struggle to realize, like, sort of how the switch happens, because he sort of, he does that whole like, oh, and then this thing becomes its opposite, and now voila, here you go. The slave is the self-sufficient one.
Right. Yeah, that is the move. Yeah.
Though he does this whole, one thing we haven't really gotten into is the fear language that he has kind of towards the end of the section. And I'm trying to find, really in 196 is where I highlighted a lot of the fear kind of.
Right, 194 I think is the first reference to fear.
First mention. Yeah. Right, for this consciousness has been fearful, not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments, but its whole being has been seized with dread.
Yeah.
For his experience, the fear of death, the absolute Lord.
Yeah. It's like, with all of my might, I want to resist the thought that Hegel adopted some kind of Aristotelian metaphysics that some people are just, created slavishly, and when faced with life and death will choose life for the sake, in exchange will kind of take on servitude. Like, it's hard not to hear that lurking in the background here, but would just be such a remarkably heinous politics that, and which is exactly what's going on in Europe at this point, is kind of like, with respect to kind of the African continent, is like, those who are enslaved just back down. They felt the fear of the Lord in a way that the white people don't, and so their enslavement is natural, and that's. So I'd love an argument here, because that's like, I don't want to, necessarily lay the kind of logic of imperialism on Hegel's doorstep right now, but it sure seems like it's close to there. Yeah. And it's kind of quasi-Nietzschean too. It's like some people, like when faced with change and difference and chaos, will rise to it, and others won't. You know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
just kind of the relation between
Yeah.
the strong and the weak. You know,
I know. Yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
nature. It's not a nice place.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess the only thing I'm thinking of too is, at least in terms of, I don't know, his answer to this, you know, because I think you're right, Adrian. He doesn't really give a way out for the bondsman or the worker, but at least he sees, you know, in stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness, a kind of deficiency in the answer of like world negation, you know, of
Right.
well, why doesn't the worker just like completely sever itself from
Yeah.
the world? And at the very least, he doesn't see that as like a viable response to the worker's dread or the worker's fear, you know, that whatever that fear is, there's got to be a different resolution than, oh, well, you know, I can't control anything, so let me just negate the world and just reside in my own consciousness and resolve my own sort of feelings.
Yeah, that's helpful. That leaves me with a better taste of Hegel in my mouth, you know. But yeah, because I think that's right. The kind of one reading of early Christianity is just kind of like, well, you know, we are an enslaved people, and so we'll just kind of lose ourselves in the ether of the super sensible because there's no way to change the world. And he's right. The unhappy consciousness and all that is not. He's gonna critique that significantly.
Totally.
So that's good.
Well,
Okay.
I gotta
get rolling.
Yeah, thanks. This was great. Thanks for talking.
Will we meet will we meet at the same time next week? Is that okay with you, Switzer?
Yep, absolutely.
All right.
Alrighty. See you guys.
Yeah, take care.